Look at it. Look at it. Look at it. Hello everyone and happy Wednesday. Today I wanted to talk about a few of my favorite books. I just finished rereading my absolute favorite book, The Picture of Dorian Gray, like 15 minutes ago, and I hadn't read it, I hadn't picked it up for about 5 or 6 years. So I kind of forgot the story a little bit, but I also got an abridged version, which I didn't know when I downloaded it to my Kindle, that it was missing a few chapters, which whatever. So I thought that since I reread that, I just read that book for the 3rd time and I still love it, even with those chapters missing, I would talk about my favorite books. So as I mentioned, my favorite book is The Picture of Dorian Gray. If you have not read it, it is the story about a beautiful young man in the late 1800s. He sits for his friend Basil, who is a painter, and Basil paints this gorgeous portrait of him. He calls it his masterpiece, and when Dorian sees it, he realizes his own beauty. He has another friend, Harry, who's telling him that he is going to lose his beauty. He's going to get old and gross like the rest of us, and that he needs to cherish this. So as soon as Dorian sees this beautiful picture and he sees how perfect he is in this moment, he cries out in a moment of passion, and he wishes that the picture would take on his age and all the horrible things that he does and anything negative, and that he would stay young and beautiful and perfect forever. So somehow it actually works, and years pass and Dorian is still young and beautiful, but he's done a lot of horrible crap. He's in his 40s and he's done a lot of bad things, and he's convinced a lot of people to either live their lives in ruin or to destroy themselves. He's actually caused people to kill themselves. So over time he notices that the portrait is taking on all of the marks of everything that he's done, and he is growing darker and darker, and his hatred for the picture and for himself and for Basil and everyone around him is increasing until it all culminates in him destroying the picture. And I'm sorry if that's a spoiler, but it's like 200 years old. So yeah. He destroys the picture and that's it. End of story. Dorian's dead. It's a short book. It's less than 100 pages, I believe, even with the chapters that are usually there. And so it's a really easy read. I reread it in like the last 3 days, so it's not a hard read. It's still my favorite novel for a number of reasons. Oscar Wilde has a way of making fun of the rich and bored, and he has a beautiful way of showing us what's going on in their head. And it makes a lot of commentary on high society in London of the time. I also think that Dorian is a character who doesn't take any responsibility for his choices. I feel like it's relevant today because so many young, beautiful people only care about being young and beautiful. This is the society we've created, and I'm not going to go into my feelings on that in this video, but I do think that the message and the characters in The Picture of Dorian Gray are relevant like an elephant, are relevant today. My next favorite book isn't exactly a book so much as it is a series of books. It's The Vampire Chronicles by Anne Rice. If you've ever met me, you know that I am obsessed with Anne Rice's vampires. I'm obsessed with vampires in general, but Anne Rice's vampires in particular are definitely my favorites. I love her language. I love the emotion that she's able to evoke in her writing. I love the visuals that she brings through. The voice of the vampire Lestat is my favorite of her vampire voices. She does later on go on to do the vampire Armand, which is one that I love, and she does one with Gabrielle, and I believe there's something with what the fuck's that guy's name? Nick or something? I don't know. So I love her voices. And of the Vampire Chronicles, my favorite, I guess, would be either the Vampire Lestat or Queen of the Damned or Memnoch the Body Snatcher or Memnoch the Devil or Tales of the Body Snatcher. They're all very good. I love them all. I think Memnoch the Devil is probably the one that most affected me. It made me think a lot more, and it had a lot deeper philosophy or a different kind of philosophy than I had seen in things like The Vampire Lestat. I'm also rereading that series because it has been well over 10 years since I read it, and I loved it, and I've only read the first 2 books in the series so far in my reread, and I still love it. It's still, her voice is still amazing. Lestat's voice is amazing. Even in Interview with the Vampire with Louis, who's a little whiny, it's still beautiful and still touched me and like made me smile and made me feel things. And the way the Vampire Chronicles is written has hugely influenced my writing. Like, you don't even know. I mean, I'm not copying, but I can absolutely feel the same kind of energy that she gives in her books. And that's kind of what I was going for, especially with the beginning of Lullaby of the Lilitude. My third favorite book is a non-fiction book called A Charmed Life by Patricia Telesco. It's a book about living a healthy spiritual lifestyle with a Wiccan influence. And it has just all kinds of activities and things to help you experience and embrace your own spirituality, as well as embracing the goddess inside of you or the divine that is inside of you. So this book I've had since I was maybe about 13 or 14. Unfortunately, I don't have the physical copies of my books right now. They're all in storage. When we moved into this place, I put a lot of my stuff away because we don't have a lot of space here, and I just have so many books and so many other things. And we are planning to move to a bigger apartment, but until then, I don't have all of my books. But A Charmed Life is probably one of my most prized possessions. The only reason I didn't bring it with me here is because I have a digital copy of it and I didn't want to have too much clutter. It gives you activities for finding your center, for finding your magical tools, for dealing with magic in the modern world, for using technology with magic. It gives you ideas for charming your commute on your way to work or class. It gives you ideas for dealing with painful events, for painful experiences, and all sorts of stuff to live a charmed life. And I do believe that I live a charmed life, and so the book is my go-to tool for guidance, for understanding of negative things or ideas on how to deal with things, and ideas for how to embrace and accept myself and accept my own shortcomings and things that I think are shortcomings, but really I'm giving too much weight to. It helps me to put things into perspective. So those are 3 of my favorite books or book series. And as a bonus, I thought I would tell you guys my least favorite book series, because I know that this is gonna get me a little bit of a hate, maybe. But I do not like Harry Potter. I am so sorry, everyone. I hear about it all the time. If you read books or you write books, that's what you hear about all the time. Someone mentions Harry Potter. I've even mentioned it because J.K. Rowling's success is extremely admirable. It's something to aspire to. It's amazing. She just, she did what she did, and I applaud that. And I applaud what Harry Potter is and that it touches people. And I loved the movies, but I read the first 3 books when I was younger, and I stopped because it just wasn't for me. And I feel like if I went back and tried to reread Harry Potter, I would feel the same way, just from my experience of rereading things that I loved, and I still loved them. And if I read something that I hated, I don't expect to love it now. I've never really been crazy about reading books that were about teenagers or kids or things like that. Even when I was a kid, most of the books I read were adult novels. I read like Harlequin romance and Harlequin intrigue. Mostly Harlequin was what I read as a kid, and I read a bunch of like encyclopedias, and I read classics like The Picture of Dorian Gray and Dracula and the entire works of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, my favorite poet. That was also one of my favorite books as a kid. I had a collection of all of her works, and it was my dream. I lost it. But Harry Potter just never appealed to me, and I get a lot of flack from that. Like, whenever I've said that in public, I get looks, and I get people going, oh, how could you not like Harry Potter? What's wrong with you? Like, nothing's wrong with me. It's a kid's story. I've never liked kid stories. Then I do kind of like some kid stories. Like, I love Humphrey the hamster. I think it's super cute. And Bunnicula, don't get me started. It's a bunny vampire that sucks the color out of vegetables and fruit. What? That's amazing. So yeah, me and Harry Potter just never really got along as a reader-book relationship. The movies, like I said, I loved up until the one with, I didn't love that much because I can't really remember their names, but the one with Cedric Diggory, I definitely remember that one. I remember crying my heart out in the scene, you know the scene? And I remember my grandmother actually laughing at me for being a 17-year-old woman and crying my heart out at watching this other 17-year-old character be obliterated, who was beautiful and wonderful and perfect in every way. And Cedric Diggory is probably the reason I didn't like the Twilight movie, to be completely honest. He was already Cedric in my head, and then he was this sparkly vampire, and I did not love it. I mean, there were a lot of reasons why I didn't like Twilight. I don't hate the Twilight books, but I'm also not a fan of those. I also hear about Twilight every time I mention that my book is a book about bloodsuckers. Like, there have been other vampires for a very, very long time. Again, I am not saying that Twilight or Harry Potter are bad stories. They're just not for me, and I also feel like we're too saturated with them. When I mention vampires, I want you to think of maybe the most popular one, Dracula. I want you to think of Nosferatu. But I also think you should consider that in Europe, the idea of vampires were not classical and beautiful. Some of them were gross. Some of them were rotting flesh beasts that like ate people's skin. They were closer to what we would call zombies today. But they were they were considered vampires. Then there are also vampires that don't suck blood, and they simply suck your life force and suck your energy. There are also vampires that specifically target certain demographics, like only children or only women. There are vampires that only suck out blood marrow, and all of them have different names, but all of them have at some point in history been called a vampire, and not all vampires are Twilight style. Those are my favorite books and some of my least favorite books. Please let me know in the comments what your favorites are, what you don't like, what you thought of these, if you have any books to recommend based on my favorites, or any books to recommend based on the ones that I don't like that you think might change my mind or might help me like it, or anything at all. Just put it in the comments, like and subscribe, and I will see you guys next week. Thank you so much. Bye.